please?
Andrew was educated, is that the right word?
I hope so. You're the guy who did it.
Deformed?
Scarred for life. Scarred for life and educated.
So there are many Chicago people in the room who know exactly the difficulty of finding the right verb. Where he wrote a fabulous dissertation, which then he turned into a book some years later, which was published by Columbia University Press. Was called Unifying Hinduism, Religion and Identity, no, Philosophy and Identity. Philosophy and Identity in Indian Intellectual History, a terrific and widely discussed book, which won the American Academy of Religion's first book award in the history of religions. Terrific, important, and consequential study of early modern intellectual history. Andrew then has gone on to do a bunch of other things, including a book for SUNY Press called A Study of the Ishvara Gita, what was the actual title? The
Lord
Song
Shiva
of the Lord,
Song.
Lord Shiva Song. Came out, I believe, a couple of years ago. He is an associate professor at SUNY Stony Brook and a voice of reason in an unreasonable world, let me put it that way. And we're delighted to have him here today. I will pass the baton to him because I don't have the actual title of your lecture in front of me. But Automaton. Oh, there it is, Hindus Against God. Perfect. Thank you for coming, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Shelley, and it's great to be here again at Columbia. And as we alluded, he was my dissertation advisor, and I'd say the single person most responsible for my intellectual career trajectory, so I'm eternally grateful to him. And the material I'm presenting today, everything that's good comes from him. Everything that's not so good, that's my fault.
Of course, I wrote the introduction to this talk.
So part of this, there are two parts. It's Hindus Against God, Anti-theistic Arguments, and Sāṃkhya and Vedānta philosophy. The first part will be on Samkhya, one of the most famous and arguably the oldest of what we now call the Hindu schools of philosophy. And so that is, I'm presenting some stuff that I wrote an article in Janardhan Ganeri's Oxford Handbook of Indian Philosophy. If you want to follow up, I'll be sort of summarizing some of the things I said there. And the second part of my talk, I'll be focusing on Vedanta, specifically Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. And this is for some new research I'm doing for Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Vedanta. There's so many handbooks going around here, some handbooks too, I think. So this will be published in 2019, edited by Ayan Maharaj. So let's get started. The Samkhya school may be the oldest among all of the affirmer or astika schools. The sage Kapila, mythological founder of Samkhya, is mentioned in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, as are some central Samkhya concepts. Some biographers of the Buddha suggested that he studied Samkhya doctrines prior to his awakening, and Samkhya had an influence on many later Hindu texts. The most famous of these is undoubtedly the Bhagavad Gita, a text that combines Samkhya terminology with a devotional theism focused on the god Krishna. Samkhya is described in most modern histories of Indian philosophy as an atheist system, yet this is certainly an oversimplification. Pre-modern doxographers in India recognize both theistic, Saishvara, and atheistic, Nir-Ishvara strains of Samkhya. One notable example of theistic Samkhya is represented in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, a text described in its most important commentary as, quote, an exposition on Samkhya, unquote, Samkhya Pravachana. Another important Samkhya commentary, the Yukti Deepika, or Light on Samkhya Argumentation, from around 800 CE, explicitly rejects an opponent's assertion that Samkhya is atheistic and briefly describes Ishvara. In the Bhagavata Purana, the Samkhya sage Kapila is even depicted as one of Vishnu's avatars. So this is the ultimate co-optation of Samkhya by Vaishnavism. There's no doubt that there have been a wide range of views on God, or Ishvara, in Samkhya texts throughout the history of this important philosophical school. The text that I will begin with today, as representing atheistic Samkhya, is the Samkhya Sutra, or Aphorisms on Samkhya. This is a late work, likely authored in the 14th or 15th centuries Common Era. It has nonetheless had an outsized influence on modern scholars' understanding to the Samkhya school, part of this due to the 19th century scholar Richard Garba's critical Sanskrit edition and translation of the Samkhya Sutra, and his emphasis on the text's rigorously atheistic argumentation. Although some of the text's modern interpreters have tried to read it as merely casting doubt on the possibility of proving Ishvara's existence, it actually goes far beyond this. The Samkhya Sutra also advances arguments whose aim is to demonstrate that Ishvara does not and cannot exist. The Samkhya Sutra is a text of 527 sutras divided into 6 sections. They address a range of different topics in ontology, epistemology, linguistic philosophy, and soteriology. The text is traditionally ascribed to Kapila, the school's putative founder, but from a historical perspective, it is difficult to establish authorship for this text, or indeed to establish the author's motivations. What is clear is that like other sutra texts of pre-modern India, such as the Yoga Sutra, the Samkhya Sutra is not a completely original work. It borrows from earlier works, most obviously the Samkhya Karika, the verses on Samkhya from around the 2nd century Common Era. Perhaps surprisingly, it also borrows selectively from the Brahma Sutra, the foundational text of the rival Vedanta philosophical school. The 2 earliest commentaries on the Samkhya Sutra were composed by Aniruddha around the 15th century Common Era and Vijnana Bhikshu in the 16th century Common Era. Little is known about Aniruddha's philosophical commitments, and his commentary is sometimes little more than a straightforward gloss to fill in the ellipses in the Samkhya Sutra. Vijnana Bhikshu, on the other hand, one of the major systematic thinkers in early modern North India, was a polymath who wrote substantial works on Samkhya, Yoga, Vedanta, and possibly even Nyaya. Vijnana Bhikshu brought to all of these works a powerful Vedantic theism and was unapologetic about seeing the god Vishnu even in apparently atheistic works, such as the Samkhya Sutras. And if you're interested in that side of things, that was part of the topic of my first book, Unifying Hinduism, which looked at this thinker, Vijnana Bhikshu, among others. Aniruddha's commentary on Samkhya Sutra 5.2 presents a cluster of arguments, including a reason why a god who is free cannot be a creator. This argument is followed by another that resembles what in Western traditions has been called the problem of evil, although here the problem is posed not in terms of evil, but in terms of suffering, dukkha. This shows Samkhya's continuity with Buddhism and with many other philosophies in India that took the fact of suffering as fundamental, and in fact the fundamental problem. So I think I have the text for you here, the first little one, and I have the Sanskrit for all of you excellent students of Guy Levitt over there. You can follow right along. I'll read the English. So this is Aniruddha's commentary on this Samkhya Sutra 5.2. If Ishvara were an independent creator, he would create even without karma. Now, if you say that he creates with karma is an auxiliary cause, then let karma be the only cause. What need is there for Ishvara? And it cannot be that the auxiliary cause obstructs the power of the primary cause, for then the primary cause would no longer be independent. Furthermore, we know from experience that all activity is either self-interested or for the sake of another. But Ishvara has no self-interested motives. Suppose his activity were for the sake of others, then it would be impossible that the created world, which consists of suffering, could be ascribed to him, since he is compassionate. Additionally, no activity is purely for the sake of others. Even by actions such as helping others, an agent furthers his own interests. Therefore, we must accept that karma alone is the cause of the world, unquote. we see the problem of suffering described here. From the incongruity of a compassionate God creating a world full of suffering, the idea of a creator God is rejected. But this argument, based on suffering, is only one in a series of arguments, some of which have received relatively little attention in the secondary literature on proofs and disproofs of God in India. The first argument concerns God's relation to other causes. It was widely accepted in India by theists and atheists alike that the law of karma determines what happens to human beings. Good actions eventually lead to pleasant results or fruits, phala, while wicked actions generate unpleasant fruits. Some schools, such as Nyaya, held that God functions as the superintendent of karma, ensuring its smooth and regular application to beings as they move through the cycle of transmigration. However, according to Samkhya Sutra 5.2 and its commentaries, positing an intelligent creator God is unnecessary, as it is perfectly logical to understand the law of karma as functioning on its own, much as scientists in the 21st century understand physical laws, such as the law of gravity, to function regularly. Few of us, even theists, insist that it is God who pushes down on falling pens and descending airplanes to ensure that they eventually return back to the surface of the earth. This preliminary argument does not establish God's non-existence, merely his superfluousness. Yet by the principle of Laghava, the Indian analog to Occam's razor, it is simpler and better to assume that there is no God. After establishing that God is not a necessary postulate to explain how the world and karmic fruits come into existence, the Samkhya Sutras present the central argument against God's existence, one based on God's psychology. It is taken as axiomatic that all action is either for one's own benefit or for the benefit of another, but the idea that God creates solely for the benefit of other beings must be ruled out. Firstly, the created world is full of suffering, which would make no sense if we understand God to be not only omnipotent, but also compassionate. Karunika is the word in Sanskrit. Secondly, from our own experience, we know that even when one aids others, one does so for one's own sake as well. For instance, altruism brings us pleasure. It gratifies us because it makes us feel good about ourselves. Aniruddha says that this leaves only one remaining possibility, that God acts for his own benefit, svopakara. Sutras 5.3 to 5.9 explore this possibility that God acts out of self-interest. But if he does so, says Sutra 5.4, that would make him just like a worldly ruler. Laukikeshvaravat. The commentator Vijnana Bhikshu explains. This is the second quote there. If it were accepted that Ishvara acts for his own benefit, then he would, like a worldly ruler, be subject to transmigration. If his desires were not fulfilled, there would be the unacceptable conclusion that he suffers. That is the meaning of this sutra, unquote. Building on this observation from the standpoint of Samkhya's dualist cosmology, Samkhya Sutras 5.6 to 8 explore the problem of desire, or raga. Without desire, it is impossible for Ishvara to be the one who creates and oversees the functioning of his creation. We see from experience that whenever there is activity, there is a desire motivating that activity. But if Ishvara is connected in any way to desire, then he is not eternally free. Desire is a part of the world of material nature, prakriti, while according to Samkhya, the spirit, or purusha, is pure consciousness, devoid of any thoughts, desires, or emotions. Like other Indian schools, including Buddhism and Vedanta, Samkhya understands someone who is truly liberated as having conquered desire. From the standpoint of Samkhya, it is indeed difficult to understand how such a being would continue to act in the world. And here Vijnana Bhikshu has a clever little philosophical move. He points out that raga is itself part of prakriti. So if Ishvara is the creator of prakriti, it would be impossible for him to have this raga, which is not yet existent. So this is what is known in Sanskrit as anyonyashraya, this flaw of mutual dependence. So he can't possibly have any desire, including the desire to create. Is there any type of God that the Samkhya Sutras can accept? The answer is a qualified yes. The entire argument against Ishvara in the Samkhya Sutra is devoted to showing the impossibility of a creator God who is eternally free. Such a freedom would include freedom from any motivation to create. But there are other conceptions of God in pre-modern India. Just as in Buddhism, there is nothing in Samkhya that would necessarily lead to the rejection of gods like Indra, Varuna, and Yama, super powerful beings who are neither omniscient nor the absolute cause of the universe. Such gods are themselves bound, full of passions, and subject to transmigration, according to Samkhya and Buddhist thought. This is addressed by Sutra 5.5, which suggests that Ishvara could just be a nominal or paribhashika designation. Vijnana Bhikshu suggests, for instance, that Ishvara is just the name we give to the first being created in every new world cycle. So that's another possibility. Some first millennium Common Era Samkhya texts did accept the idea of an eternally free being called Ishvara. Perhaps most notably a commentary on Samkhya Karakas called the Yukti Deepika, or Light on Samkhya Reasoning, from around the 8th century Common Era. This designation was not just nominal in the sense suggested by the Samkhya Sutra to designate a super powerful being like Indra or Varuna, who still suffers. According to the Yukti Deepika, Ishvara takes a majestic body, Mahatmya Sharira, and acts in the world without suffering or experiencing ignorance due to his association with Prakriti, material nature. Responding to a theistic opponent who mistakenly accuses Samkhya of denying the existence of God entirely, the author of the Yukti Deepika clarifies this particular understanding of Ishvara. So this is another, you could say, theistic version of Samkhya. And it's right here at the bottom of the page. The opponent says, "What's more, Scripture teaches that he possesses a form, wearing a skin, pinaka, bow in hand, having a drawn bow, black-crested, and so forth. If this is accepted, your view is refuted. From the language of the Scriptures, a God who possesses a form is accepted, and therefore his existence is established. For it is impossible for a non-existent thing to possess a form." The Samkhya replies, "This too is mistaken, since you do not understand our intended meaning. We do not completely reject the particular power of Ishvara, his assuming a majestic body, etc. Our intended meaning is just that there is no being different from Prakriti and Purusha, and the instigator of these two, as you claim. Therefore, your view is refuted. The conjunction between Prakriti and Purusha is not instigated by another being." The Yukti Deepika is a theistic Samkhya text, but it does not accept the idea of an absolute creator God responsible for effecting this conjunction between these two fundamental principles, Prakriti and Purusha, which is precisely the sort of God described in the Bhagavad Gita and indeed in many Puranas. This Ishvara is nonetheless capable of taking a body and engaging in worldly activity. But what kind of activity might a being who has never experienced desire engage in, and how does he do so? Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, another first millennium Samkhya text, might offer a clue. Yoga Sutra 1.24 describes a being named Ishvara who is a, quote, special Purusha untouched by the afflictions, karma, the fruition of karma, and subconscious predispositions, unquote. In subsequent sutras, Patanjali's text also establishes that Ishvara is omniscient and that, quote, he is also the teacher of the ancients since he is not limited by time, unquote. It is nowhere suggested by Patanjali or his early commentator Vyasa that this Ishvara creates the world. But Patanjali's Ishvara does take embodiment in the time-bound world of Prakriti for the sake of teaching. On my reading, he is a compassionate, omniscient being who, though possessed of extraordinary power, is not an omnipotent being on whom the suffering of the created world can be blamed. So perhaps a little bit like a Samkhya Bodhisattva here, someone who's helping everyone, but he's not ultimately responsible, or nor is he omnipotent. As we see from the Yukti Deepika and Yoga Sutras, it may be possible to accept Samkhya's dualism and still support the idea of a God who takes embodiment for the sake of worldly action without being dragged down by association with Prakriti. But is it possible to uphold the idea of a creator God? What responses do the theistic schools in India have for the Samkhya critique based on God's absence of desire? The most famous response is undoubtedly the idea that creation is God's play, lila. So this is where the idea of lila comes up. It's in response to a real theological problem. In the Brahma Sutras, the foundational text of the Vedanta school, the discussion of play, lila, comes in response to a challenge from a philosophical opponent, perhaps the Samkhya, perhaps the Mīmāmsaka, it's possible. At Brahma Sutra 2.132, the opponent suggests that there could be no possible reason for the highest being to create the world due to an absolute lack of desire. Quote, the highest being is not the creator of a world, since all creators have a motive, unquote. The Vedanta response comes in the next sutra. Quote, but the highest being's creation is just play, lila, as we see in the world, unquote. So, lokavat tu lila kaivalyam. This is 2.233 in the Brahma Sutras. Vedanta commentators agree that God's creation is itself without motive, prayojana. Ramanuja's example is that God is like a king playing a game with balls. He has no motives outside the game itself. Contemporary scholars of Vedanta have suggested that perhaps this is better understood as an argument by analogy. God's activity is like human play insofar as it is an example of motiveless activity, but God does not literally play. But commentators say he literally plays. This is a God who plays. Immediately following this argument for God's motiveless play, the imagined anti-theistic interlocutor responds with a variation on a familiar problem, the problem of suffering. If God does create, he says, then God is guilty of inequality, vaishamya, and his arbitrarily placing different beings on different levels in the cosmic hierarchy, and cruelty, nayagritnya, insofar as it is in his power that no being whatsoever should experience suffering. Brahma Sutra 2.134 answers this familiar sounding objection with a response that may be surprising. In his role as creator, Ishvara is constrained. He can only act in accord with the law of karma and cannot contravene it. Therefore, he is not responsible for the individual's station in the world, high or low. Solely the individual's previous actions determine whether he or she is a millionaire or a pauper. Ishvara cannot suspend the impersonal processes of karma by immediately cutting off the fruits of previous actions and liberating a worshipper who is dear to him, for example. So this is from Shankara's commentary on this verse. I think this is also here on the flip side of the page. So this is his response to the atheist. It does not logically follow that Ishvara is guilty of inequality and cruelty. Why? It is because of his accountability. Sapekshatvat. If Ishvara alone, without any accountability, produced this unequal world, then he would be guilty of inequality and cruelty. However, as creator, he is not free from account. He is accountable as he produces the created world. To what is he accountable? We say he is accountable to merit, dharma, and demerit, adharma. Hence the world is unequal because of the merit and demerit of the beings who are created. It is not Ishvara's fault. Unquote. At first glance, this argument from Shankara appears to be remarkably obtuse. After all, isn't Ishvara the creator of all beings? If he is, then why not create them from the beginning to be full of merit and free from demerit? In this vein, at Brahma Sutra 2.135, the anti-theistic interlocutor interjects that before creation there was no difference between beings, so Ishvara could have chosen otherwise. This argument might convince those who believe that the world and individual selves had a beginning in time. However, theistic schools of philosophy in classical India were virtually unanimous in agreeing that God does not create from nothing. This is a central difference of Indic traditions and Christian traditions, obviously. According to the theory of causality shared by both the Sāṃkhya and Vedānta schools, called Satkaryavada, creation in general is understood as coming to a fulfillment of something that already exists in latent form. Shankara, like other Vedanta commentators on this section, responds that God isn't to blame for humans' unhappy states of existence. According to Brahma Sutra 2.135 and 36, all beings in the world are beginningless. Therefore, they have only their past actions to blame for their current condition in life. Shankara explains, quote, "It makes sense that samsara is beginningless. For if samsara had a beginning, then since it would arise without a prior cause, even liberated beings might again find themselves in samsara. Since there would be no cause of the world's unequal allotment of pleasure and pain, results would not be due to previous good or bad actions. Furthermore, without previous good or bad actions, embodiment in samsara cannot occur. Yet without embodiment, there can be no actions. So if one maintains that samsara has a beginning, there is a logical problem of reciprocal dependence. However, if samsara is beginningless, then their arising presents no logical problem, as in the case of the seed and the sprout. Moreover, the beginninglessness of samsara is taught and revealed in traditional texts." And here, there's more I could say, but this idea of anaditva, beginninglessness, is a very fundamental one. I don't think it's received quite enough attention as it should. There was a very nice talk here at Columbia 2 weeks ago, some of you may have attended, where Kat Pruitt, who works on Kashmir Shaivism, talked about this precise theme, the idea of beginninglessness, anaditva, in Shaiva traditions, and their debates with the Buddhist philosopher and logician Dharmakirti, precisely on what it means to be beginningless. But maybe in the question and answer we can talk more about beginninglessness. Not only is God limited insofar as he requires some material cause out of which to create, like a potter enters clay, Vedanta commentators also portray Ishvara as accountable, sapeksha, to something, namely to the past good and bad deeds of those beginningless selves. He does not, therefore, blindly assign high or low stations to beings. He determines rebirths only with regard to beings' past actions. Nor would it seem can God give special dispensation to some beings who are dear to him, to liberate some beings whose past bad deeds might not seem to qualify them for liberation. Being accountable means allotting results that are strictly in accord with their past actions, without any room for special individual dispensations. Otherwise, the argument that God is cruel or arbitrary in his treatment of beings would be quite true. Ishvara is the governor, adhishtatra, of this world, and of the allotment of karmic fruits. But unlike worldly governors, he does not have the power to commute a sentence that has been justly handed down by the courts. This calls into question Ishvara's omnipotence and perhaps brings to mind the Euthyphro dilemma from Western philosophy. It also seems to contradict later Hindu devotional traditions, especially prominent in the Puranas, that maintain that the fruit of lifetimes of wicked actions can be wiped away instantaneously through God's grace. Through Vedantic arguments that action devoid of a self-interested motive is possible, that God is not guilty of cruelty, since he acts only in accord with the law of karma, and that the selves are beginningless and hence responsible for their own situations, Vedantins claim to have successfully responded to arguments of Hindu anti-theistic traditions. But this comes at a cost. One main tension in the Brahma Sutra's theism is that while the concept of play, presented at Brahma Sutra 2.134, evokes the idea of a God who possesses childlike spontaneity and creativity, Sutras 2.135-37 seem to suggest that God's freedom and spontaneity is merely apparent and not real. His job description requires rigid adherence to a prior set of rules in the governance of the world. Otherwise, his detractors will be correct in portraying him as amoral and capricious. In this vein, the historian Hajime Nakamura sets up a stark contrast between what he calls the Automaton God of the Brahma Sutras and the God of later devotionally oriented Vedantic sects. So here's what one of my favorite historians says about this. Quote, "The attempt to use the law of karma to solve the problem of individual sufferings in a Brahman-created world is a special point of the philosophy of the Brahma Sutra. At the same time, the highest God was not an absolutely free personal God because he is dependent upon external factors for world creation. Since he merely allocates the karmic effect appropriate to the individual self, his function was that of an automaton. He is a stern God and not a God of grace. He is a God who makes possible individual action, bondage, and liberation, and is the basis of all things, but merely acts as a mechanism and does not positively encourage either good or bad acts on the part of individual selves. This God merely abides without doing anything in particular. For the spiritual liberation of the individual self is dependent upon the religious discipline and practice of the individual. The burning bhakti worship of later Hindu sects is not seen in the Brahma Sutra, unquote. Even if we accept the Vedantic argument for the possibility of God acting purely spontaneously and without any external motive, like a king at play, the Brahma Sutra's subsequent arguments defending Ishvara from the charge of cruelty play into the first proof presented in Aniruddha's commentary on Samkhya Sutra 5.2. If Ishvara is merely a large cog in the universal machine of samsara, constrained by karma to follow a strict set of rules in his governance of the world, what explanatory need is there for a God or Ishvara at all? It would be simpler, hence better, to eliminate God as a karmic middleman. We may simply explain the sufferings and pleasures of the world as part of an automatic, beginningless causal process, as Samkhya, Buddhist, and Jaina philosophers do. And it is not only rational inference that leads us to this conclusion. As Aniruddha points out in his commentary on Samkhya Sutra 5.12, there is also scriptural testimony suggesting that primordial nature, or prakriti, is the cause of all worldly phenomena. According to him, one can better understand scriptural references to Ishvara's creation of the entire universe as poetic license, a nominal Ishvara, who is powerful but not ultimately responsible for world creation. So that's the Samkhya part of my talk, but I promised you some Vedanta atheism. So I'm going to turn my attention to Shankara, who you might be looking at me funny now, because he just argued in the Brahma Sutra Bhashya, his commentary on the Brahma Sutra, that God exists. And yet, as some of you may already be aware, it's more complicated than that for sure. So Shankaracharya, who lived around the 8th century, was a theist from one perspective. So he argues against this Samkhya or Mimamsa interlocutor who claims that Ishvara cannot exist and claims to have proven why based on desire. And yet, on another level, Shankara says that Ishvara does not exist. So how and why can this be? Well, as a Vedanta philosopher, as many of you know, he took as the primary source of his philosophy the end of the Veda. That's what Vedanta literally means, right? Veda, Anta. In other words, the Upanishads. And the Upanishads, as he understood them, are emphatically non-dualist, Advaita. Shankara borrows an earlier distinction from Buddhism, specifically Madhyamaka Buddhism, between the two truths of conventional, Vyavaharika, and ultimate, Paramarthika truth. And that's one of the things that's functioning in this particular text, his ability to toggle between these two levels of truth in his commentary on the Brahma Sutra. The level of the conventional or transactional, Vyavahara literally means a kind of transaction, like going to the grocery store and giving them $5 for a mango. That's transaction. Very nice, fancy mango if it's $5. So this is the level of worldly affairs. And we must, according to Shankara, operate on this level when dealing with things in the world. We must assume a multiplicity of beings when we buy that mango, or most importantly for a Brahmin like Shankara, when we engage in ritual activity. Rituals have different parts. They're ordered both temporally and spatially. And the Veda itself has different divisions, right? This is why we must, on one level, function as if conventional reality and the level of multiplicity is true. However, at the highest level, the level of ultimate or paramarthika truth, Shankara understood the Upanishads to say that the only unity is real and multiplicity is unreal. And it is in this regard that he departs self-consciously from earlier realist interpretations of the Upanishad, specifically the realist school of Bheda Bheda, or difference and non-difference Vedanta. I think sometimes when people look at his commentary on the Brahma Sutra, they forget that he's actually reacting against an earlier realist tradition within Vedanta, and arguably, as I've argued elsewhere, the Brahma Sutras themselves were a kind of realist form of Vedanta. So I gave you a little snippet from Shankara here to know the context. It helps to have memorized the entire Veda, if not that, at least the Chandogya Upanishad. There's a famous dialogue many of you have read between Uddalaka Aruni, the father, and Shvetaketu, the son. And Aruni teaches Shvetaketu certain secret correspondences, which is one of the meanings of the word Upanishad. And this is what he says about clay. This is father talking to the son. From Chandogya 6:1-4. It is like this, son. By means of just one lump of clay, one would perceive everything made of clay. The transformation is a verbal handle, a name, while the reality is just this. It's clay. So this is Patrick Olivel's translation of this famous part of the Chandogya. And the important word here in Sanskrit is what Olivel translated as verbal handle. The word in Sanskrit is vach arambana, having its origin in vach, in speech, merely verbal. And it's on that word that Shankara's entire interpretation of this passage of the Chandogya pivots. So I've given you a little snippet from his commentary on the Brahma Sutra, where he gives this anti-realist interpretation based on this word vacharambana. So first, so this is the last quote from the handout on the flip side. First, the opponent says, or the realist Vedantin says, Brahman is manifold. As a tree has multiple branches, so Brahman has multiple powers. Hence, oneness and multiplicity are both true. The tree is one, but multiple with regard to its branches. The sea is one, but multiple with regard to its waves and its foam. The clay is one, but multiple with regard to pots and plates made of clay. Shankara replies, this is incorrect because the Upanishad statement, as clay they are true, merely asserts that the cause is true, while the statement, having its origin in speech, vacharambana, or as Olivel translates it, verbal handle, asserts that all of the effects are false. And then a little bit later in this argument, as it applies to Ishvara, he says, Ishvara's being Lord, his Ishvaraness, his lordliness, his omniscience, and his omnipotence are such only with regard to the limiting conditions whose nature is ignorance, avidya. In ultimate truth, the self's nature, true nature, free of all limiting conditions, is revealed by knowledge. And the conventions of being Lord, of having a Lord, of omniscience, etc., do not apply to the self, unquote. So too of Ishvara, because of course, being a Lord is a relational concept. To be Lord, you must lord over something, subjects, piece of land. There are no subjects, there is no piece of land. There's only Brahman, or only the highest self, as he says, Paramatma. So, on the level of conventional reality, Shankara assists that Ishvara exists, and indeed that Ishvara can be proven. On the level of conventional reality, he accepts this famous Nyayika proof, similar to the argument from design and Western traditions of God's existence, while simultaneously arguing on the level of ultimate reality that, based on passage like the one we just read from the Chandogya Upanishad, the Lord does not truly exist. And yet, at the very end of this passage, is this commentary on Brahma Sutra 2.1.14, Shankara says, well, it's really important that we accept this, you can call it a noble lie, convenient fiction, of God's existence. He says, the understanding of Brahman is subject to change will be of use in the worship upasana of Brahman with qualities, saguna Brahman. And then in this context, he cites a passage from the Bhagavad Gita. And you can understand Shankara's Bhagavad Gita as precisely having this kind of project. The Bhagavad Gita is for people who aren't ready for the ultimate liberating knowledge and have to engage in these lower forms, such as devotional worship to God. And he cites Bhagavad Gita 1861, a very interesting verse. It says, "The Lord, Ishvara, is situated in the heart of all beings. He twirls them all around as though they were mounted on a yantra, on a machine." It's like, imagine a turntable and some puppets going up and down. That's all of us in this room right now. The Lord is situated in our hearts and he's making us do these things. From one perspective. On the other's perspective, there is no Lord and there are no beings. Similarly, we can say that Samkhya can accept the performance of certain types of non-violent Vedic sacrifices to the gods can be of a worldly or conventional use insofar as it allows merit to accrue. If you have an ashram off in the forest, you may want to placate these very powerful beings in the same way you might want to placate the king in that particular region by paying honor to him so he doesn't bother you and prevent you from achieving moksha. Yet ultimately, both Shankara and the atheist Samkhya thinkers I've talked about today are on the same page regarding the path to liberation. Knowledge, jnana, alone liberates. Actions, whether it be yoga, Vedic sacrifice, devotion to God, can only be an intermediate cause and not a direct cause of liberation. I'll end my talk there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The floor is open for questions.
I realize not all of you are philosophers or Sanskritists, so rudimentary questions are certainly also welcome. Oftentimes the rudimentary ones are the most interesting, I think.
Can I ask a rudimentary question?
Okay.
I'm curious about something outside the talk and just
Okay.
about the stakes of atheism and was this something, it seems to me it wasn't highly policed in
Right.
South Asia compared to elsewhere,
Yeah.
at least in, from what I've seen. And could you speak a little bit about that? At least there are certain societies where being a non-believer would be
Right.
something that the state would repress. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about
Yes.
that.
So yeah, I think you're absolutely right that your intuition that nobody really cared that much about whether you were Seishvara, theistic, literally Sa Ishvara, with God, or Nir Ishvara. This is a term that comes up mostly in philosophical debates, but I think there were other ways of defining in-groups and out-groups that were much more salient and important to people, whether in classical India or in talking late medieval, early modern period, than this question of God. Which is why I think it's unfortunate that some scholars who know better still translate words like Nastika as atheist.
Atheist.
Certainly in Hindi, that's what it means, right? Nastik.
Yeah.
But that is because of the pressure on these Abrahamic traditions on modern Hindi and other modern languages. That is emphatically not what Nastika or Astika meant in the classical period that I'm mostly working with. And we know that because Mimamsa and Samkhya are very frequently atheist traditions, and they're also classified as Astika, what I like to call a firmer tradition. So whatever the stake there in terms of defining in-groups and out-groups during this classical and medieval period, it does not seem to be the question of God's existence or non-existence. So who cares? I mean, from a historical perspective, probably not that many people. This is the tragedy of working as a historian of Indian philosophy is that, who was really paying attention to these relatively abstruse theological debates? I'm not sure that many people.
Well, can I jump in
Yes,
there?
please.
The problem of atheism is actually even bigger than your chart. It's in some ways ubiquitous in early Indian thought. The Buddhists, the Jains, Mimamsikas.
But is the problem they're atheists?
Let me hold on. Well, it's the problem. I don't know that the problem that they're atheists, but it's everywhere. And in fact, it's only quite later, and maybe in the 9th or 10th, 11th century, that the transformation towards a much more theistically oriented intellectual world begins to happen. But then, what's interesting is we're not. Some of this is Larry McRae's argument, and I think he's largely correct. But what's the interesting point that connects with what Allison said is that when the transformation does begin to happen, say in the 10th century in Kashmir, 12th, 13th century in South India, it's most decidedly linked with state processes. So people do begin to care. The rise of the entire temple culture of South India, driven by ruling elites, linked with theistically inclined Mimamsikas now. So in the beginning of the 12th and 13th century, Shiv here, I don't know if Shiv is here, but Shiv Subramanian is studying Vedanta Deshika, who's one of the key figures who creates a theistical Mimamsa, Seshwara Mimamsa.
Right.
Think of Kashmir, where in the 10th and 11th centuries, the Shaiva institutionalization of Shaivism brings with it a new logic that is really theistical. I mean, it's striking that the old logic, the Prachina logic, the old logic of India doesn't care about God at all. I think God is mentioned once in the Nyaya Sutras. So some people do begin to care at some point, and they begin to care in serious institutional forms, and apparently in some sort of political forms. But the real question is, what is the relationship between that whole side of life and the intellectual life? What is the relationship between, why did intellectuals start to become clients of kings in a way they may not have been earlier? I mean, there's no sense that Kumarila, for example, maybe the greatest philosopher in the mid-first millennium, ever had any sort of appointment anywhere. They were sort of freischweibende intellectuals, they were just floating, it seems. But they all, the beginning of the second millennium becomes something changes quite dramatic. Do you have any thoughts about
Yes, I have two thoughts. So, number one, I'm still not quite convinced that theism or atheism per se is the issue. There are other kinds of institutional issues. It's not just God exists, it's which God is the primary, right? That's a big issue.
Right.
And so I don't think that, again, as Allison's point, I think rightly made, the mere existence or non-existence of God per se is not quite the issue. Although certainly Larry, you know theistic Mimamsa, and so is Larry much better than me, but I think he's right about that. Second point I'll make, this is why the Samkhya Sutra is so completely anomalous. This is a 14th century text, and it's the first text in Samkhya, in the history of Samkhya, to explicitly say God does not exist. There may have been earlier texts we've lost. Samkhya Karaka, which is the quote-unquote classical text, never says God doesn't exist. It doesn't present any proofs for God's non-existence. The earliest commentaries we have on the Samkhya Karaka, they accept, like the Yukti Dipika, some form of God. So I had this conversation with Larry once. I'm like, well, that may be Mimamsa, but Samkhya is exactly inverted. The earliest forms of Samkhya, it appears to me, were theistic in some form. And again, theism is a huge term that can mean a lot of. Theos is, who knows what that even means, right? Depends on the intellectual context. But it appears to me that theistic Samkhya is actually the older form of Samkhya. And somehow, somebody in the 14th century, maybe he was just like some naysayer jerk, decided to write this Samkhya text and call himself Kapila. I'd love to know, I wish I knew this, the intellectual history and where it was composed and by whom, but we just don't have that information available. So in Samkhya, at least, it seems to be reversed. But in Mimamsa, I certainly take your point. Yes, friend.
Well, for another a basic kind of question, once you've got karma and you've got rebirth, you've got a very efficient sort of moral engine for making people behave well. And so from that point of view, a God is kind of icing on the cake or decorative or redundant or something like that. Even if you don't overtly declare that you're atheistic, you certainly have got a remarkably well-functioning mechanism to dispense with a God.
Sure.
So could you talk about, you said, is it lagura is the term for Occam's razor? Could you talk about that principle and how it's applied and whether it comes along early or late?
So laghu means light, so really lightness. You don't want to unnecessarily, when we talk about ontology, naming the kinds of things that there are in the world, you don't want to create unnecessary layers and layers of ontology. In general, the simplest explanation is the best explanation. This is one intellectual principle. It's certainly not the only one. Certainly there are many Indian intellectuals who loved having elaborate ontologies. But this is an important intellectual principle. And as I see it, it points to a real fundamental problem in the Brahma Sutras themselves, this foundational text of Vedanta. Because you can't have two absolutes. By definition, there's only one absolute. The Brahma Sutra gives us two absolutes. It gives us Brahman, which is described as the source of everything. And then it gives us, a little bit later, this strange character named Ishvara, who seems to be some sort of personal God. Brahman, at least on some early interpretations, is not, of course, it gets more complicated with bhakti and things like that, but it can be understood as a kind of impersonal source of creation. Brahman, of course, is a neuter term, right? It doesn't necessarily have a personality, which is why there are lots of fights in modern Hinduism between the ISKCON folks, who are part of this realist Beda tradition, casting aspersions upon this Advaita Vedanta impersonalism is what they call it, and how this is false, and this is a false reading of the Bhagavad Gita. Certainly that's not what the Bhagavad Gita says, right? Unless you take it all as a kind of sham, as Shankara's basic argument. I know there are other Advaita Vedanta scholars who are going to ding me for that, but I really do think that he thinks this is for someone whose adhikara is not quite advanced enough to be ready for the ultimate. And so his solution to this fundamental problem, you can't have two absolutes, is to say there's really only one absolute. The other one is a kind of fiction. But of course it's the same kind of fiction that this entire world is, that my pen is, that you and I are. He is just as real as all of us in this room are, which is not real at all from the ultimate perspective, but from the conventional perspective, real. And that's why there's this interesting ontology in Advaita Vedanta where this world of transaction is anirvachaniya. It's neither completely real or completely unreal. It's at this kind of intermediate stage of ontology. And there are certain things that are completely unreal. The horns of hares and sky lotuses, those are unreal. They don't have the status that my pen and our conversation right now has. But moving beyond that, we can say there's just one absolute. And this is what my research right now is focused on, is early Vedantic attempts to deal with this problem of Ishvara in the Brahma Sutra pre-bhakti. So we're talking very early realist traditions. There's one particular really interesting realist philosopher named Bhaskaracharya, who hasn't gotten a whole lot of attention. He was a near contemporary or younger contemporary of Shankara, who just goes bonkers on Shankara for presenting this kind of adhunika, new modern version of, this is 8th century, modern version of Vedanta that completely departs from the Brahma Sutras and the Upanishads. And I think I agree with Bhaskara on this one, that Shankara solves a problem by destroying the entire edifice of realist Vedanta that came before him. Yes?
So I have a question from a philosophical perspective. I don't know very much about these traditions. Just a question about what the stakes are for identifying this as theism or anti-theism, and what the meaning of Ishvara is, because what you just said, especially about Brahman versus Ishvara, now it seems like, I mean, what I got from the picture you were sketching is, in the face of certain kinds of variants of the problem of evil, that you can see a retreat from a more classic theism to something that gets called deism in the early modern period in the West. So not a personal God, somehow God runs the machine or is a cosmic administrator, which is in the West an idea that has ancient roots in Stoicism. But that picture starts to look not just controversial against the background of Christianity, but I think more generally controversial as having a commitment to anything divine at all, because you can just stick with the mechanism. So against that background, it seems like the very concept of Ishvara seems to mean something like a God who's more than the machine, and the idea of lordliness might, the relational idea might connote something like not necessarily freedom, but being worthy of more respect, which is another kind of interpersonal or personal concept. Respect or honor that a machine wouldn't. So getting away from, there's certain kinds of issues with relationality that seem specific to one kind of philosophical argument, but more broadly, a complaint about Western deism is that you can't, whatever you think about Christianity, even if you're a universalist, you can't worship that God. And I wonder if that is any part of the motivation for the relabeling of these philosophical positions as controversially theistic or anti-theistic.
Well, so of course, when I say theism or atheism, these are my words, translations of things like Nirishvara and Seishvara. And there's so much there to unpack in what you just said, but I'll try to keep it fairly brief. So, first of all, one of the interesting things, besides this complete absence in my awareness of the idea of creation ex nihilo, there's also a complete lack, as far as I'm concerned, of a true idea of omnipotence in India. So when they say something like Ishvara is has sarvakartritva, literally all-doingness, that doesn't mean he can create a pond so great that he can't jump over all these classic kind of Western theological problems. It means that given his station in the world, his powers are appropriate to do the things that he's supposed to be doing. Administering karmic justice, taking the raw stuff of the elements and fashioning out of that raw stuff a world that is well ordered and makes sense. Those are the sorts of things he is capable of doing. He's not capable of doing absurd, ridiculous things. Right? So in many ways, I think their conception of God is emphatically different than an Islamic or classical Christian conception of God. And
I think there's some diversity in both of those traditions.
Absolutely,
but not everyone thinks it's really only in the 16th century we get the crazy absurd. It's pretty late that you get the crazy making round squares, the things that Hume complains about, for what it's worth. But actually, I think there are good parallels.
But yes, I know it's just such a big topic. But so, what is Brahman then? Well, that's one of the things I'm trying to sort of figure out, especially in these very early commentaries on the Brahma. Why even include Ishvara in the text? What's it doing there? Is it just a kind of sop to people who, they have a need for some God who smiles and drives a chariot and plays the flute? Or, is there some more serious kind of intellectual work being done there? And I'm not sure quite yet. And I'm also unconvinced by these later bhakti-oriented traditions, starting, of course, with Ramanuja. Most people, they associate Vedantic realism with devotionalism, with bhakti, but there's an earlier non-devotional beta realist tradition, and trying to sort of excavate that and understand why in that tradition would we need to posit these two absolutes. I'm afraid I don't have a good answer to that question, yet alone the massive kind of comparative issues. I'll point you to this article I wrote on in the Oxford Handbook of Indian Philosophy is comparative and goes to a bit greater depth and compares this to a few Western theological pictures of God and process theology and Aquinas and stuff. So that might be one place to start thinking about this, but I'd love to have more of a conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Andrew, I was wondering if you can just help us read Brahma Sutra 2.1.34 in a little more detail. It might be
So this is the penultimate quote there?
Yeah, the response to the atheists.
Yes.
In Shankara. So, one reason why it may not be that the outcome of this argument is reducible and dismissible to some deist idea or the idea of some automaton is that he's actually insisting on using the rhetoric of accountability. Right? So it's not obvious that he thinks of it in purely mechanistic terms.
Shankara.
Okay. Yeah. So to what extent is dismissing it as eventually being nothing but reducing to an automata status, something he might resist by the rhetoric here? I'm just curious, right? Because when you are accountable in the sense that's being asserted here, you're accountable to merit, he says, right? So when one is accountable to something like a norm, a merit and demerit, if it's one's genuinely accountable, it should be possible, logically possible, to be able to make a mistake.
Right.
Right? It's only if you cannot make a mistake that you just do something in the way the mechanism does it. Right? So the very idea of being accountable to a merit or demerit requires there to be the possibility of a mistake, a possibility of not just doing the right thing all the time, because then you're a rational automaton, right? Which is the dismissal.
Right.
So the question is, surely there isn't any commitment in this passage to the possibility of a mistake. So one question to ask is there anything in Shankara which says this is a degenerate case of the idea of accountability? That is, it doesn't become, you don't have to give up a thesis, but you can see some things, Ishvara being such a thing, as a limiting or a limiting case of accountability. You can't make a mistake in being accountable to merit and demerit. So in that sense, it would be like an automaton if it were not a limiting case.
Right.
But surely he's committed to some idea that Ishvara is a limiting case. It's not like after all, he's not embodied and so on, which is how an automaton is usually got either hardware or a body and so on, right? So this is clearly not the case. So
Ishvara is embodied, right? According to
but at the time of creation and so on, right? I mean,
he has to have a body to be able to.
But then if that is so, then is he capable of making a mistake in these adjudications?
This is the sort of thing that Western philosophers always ask when they're confronted with things like karma. And unfortunately, it's hard to, this is where rational reconstruction comes in, because there is not a robust discourse in pre-modern India around these very familiar issues of free will and very common answer to why is it that evil exists in the world. In Christian traditions as well, God had to create human beings in order to allow them to make mistakes. So I honestly don't know the answer to your question, but it could certainly go in several different directions. The thought I had as I was reading over this on the train on the way here is, there are certainly some kinds of decisions which are morally neutral, right? So sometimes Ishvara is constrained, but he may have a certain kind of spontaneous freedom when it comes to other things, Is Ishvara going to order chocolate or vanilla ice cream today? This does not seem to me necessarily to be a decision constrained by karma, right? So it is possible that there is a realm of freedom or spontaneity, but then there are also different sorts of acts that Ishvara is bound necessarily to have. But this is exactly where I wish commentators would, or sub-commentators or sub-sub-commentators would say, okay, here's what he's doing when he talks about accountability. And usually they don't give us this kind of robust discourse that we might like. That's not a very good answer, I realize. And this is my translation. Sāṃkhya Shuddha. I don't know. Does anyone else have?
Because it's like something.
Do you like? What do you like?
I think the idea of accountability. I'm not sure if this is what Akil is getting to. Seems to have a moral valence about it. So this that has no moral valence at all. It's not to correct you, but I would say this simply means that God is dependent on other forces. It does not logically follow that Ishwar is guilty of inequality. Why? Because he has no freedom. He is completely dependent. If Ishwar alone, without any freedom, produces this unequal world, then he would be guilty of inequality. However, as creator, he is not free from independence. He is not free from dependence.
Yeah.
He is dependent as he produces the world.
That was how I initially translated it. That sounds really harsh, doesn't it?
Well, I think that's what it means. I mean, the word so frequently references. Nirapekshatva is when you are completely independent in your functioning. I think accountability risks prompting an objection of the sort I think Akil was trying to make, which suggests.
How do you read accountable to merit and demerit?
God is completely dependent on pre-existing dharma and adharma, pre-existing events in the world, pre-existing human action.
But
cannot change the order of things.
It's to merit that he's accountable.
Yes, but merited maybe even, this is again a really complex question of translation. What do we mean by
karma? Karma.
But that's crucial.
Right.
You see, if you're accountable to something that's just what it is, a tendency, a force of prakriti, a force of nature, that's one thing. But to be accountable to merit can't be just a tendency. Merit and the ongoing tendencies and events of nature are two different kinds of things.
I don't think
merit. It's shot through with something which is not just force.
Think of dharma instead of as natural law, the foundation of all things, right? It doesn't just govern human relations or even the relations of beings who have cognition. It governs the rock outside and the tree, and so I think in a more fundamental way. I'm afraid. That's where I think he's pushing. I can see, I get interesting ways that some constructive modern Hindu Vedanta thinker would try to defend him along the lines you suggest, but from how I take the original and from the intellectual milieu it's in, it seems like he's playing right into the hands of Aniruddha here.
So merit precisely doesn't mean merit.
It doesn't mean merit.
Merit means
no arguing with that.
Merit means merit and a lot of. This is the impossibility of translating Sanskrit words like dharma, right?
Okay.
Dharma is by definition impossible to translate, but it doesn't just govern relations of ethical beings, right? It governs the relations of lions and gazelles. It governs the relation of trees and their growth.
This is not a moral argument.
Yeah. It is a moral argument, but it's way beyond a moral argument. Yeah.
So are you, this is another question from almost not complete ignorance, but close to it. So are you saying that there's nobody in this discussion that says, forget dharma, forget karma, it doesn't exist, we're not talking about it, it's not there?
Well, certainly on the level of ultimate truth, karma doesn't exist because karma is action, and anything that happens.
That doesn't accept.
Doesn't accept the law of karma.
Quote, law of karma.
Yeah.
Is that part of the? I thought you had said earlier.
So there is a kind of rare minority viewpoint here. Of course, Buddhists, Jains all accept karma. This is, I write in my first book, this is, I think, the salient issue when it comes to defining insiders and outsiders. Whether you believe in some kind of ethical, foundational, I don't want to call it ethical because we just had this conversation, but believe in some kind of rules governing people getting their just desserts. And there is one outstanding example of folks who don't believe that. They're called the Charvakas or Lokayatas, the materialists. But they're not part of this conversation, and we're pretty clearly, by the 15th century, they were just the whipping boy that you trot out. We don't even know because we don't have any of their actual writings, we only have their opponents' writings about them. Various people, Indologists, that try to sort of reconstruct. Johannes Bronkhorst is one of them, a more kind of sympathetic reading of what Charvaka, or this kind of materialist argument that, there's no life after this one, there's no gods, do whatever you like, drink your ghee today for tomorrow you die, that kind of idea. That was there in ancient India, but it very clearly seems to be a minority viewpoint that isn't really part of this discussion. That's why I said at the beginning, all of the players accept karma, they accept something like dharma. The question is the details. Is there some superintending being? Is it purely an automatic process? But in this regard, Samkhya is a lot more like Buddhism and Jainism, especially Jainism. There are a lot of affinities between Samkhya and Jainism, and a lot less like quote-unquote Hindu philosophies as we normally understand them as being theistic and worshipping Shiva or Vishnu or whatever. So that's the basic answer to your question. Yeah.
No, I wanted to go back to this again because you translated Sapeksha as accountability.
Okay.
And Shelley translated Sapeksha as dependent.
Yes.
Right.
Shelley is right. I'm wrong. This is the correct answer when you're a student. The Guru Shishya.
Why do you think of condition? Because I think in the Sapeksha, condition is not very different from dependent.
Okay.
And the other thing which I think is very interesting to the conversation between you and Akhil is that dharma obviously means both things. Dharma actually means the dharma of the bird is to fly, which is dharma which is completely non-ethical.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the dharma of somebody is to do the right thing in a particular situation.
Exactly.
So is there, can you say something more about, are these two terms at play in the Brahma Sutra in that section? Because I think we would get a richer question if we hold on to both these meanings of dharma. Now, if we separate the two meanings of dharma, I think it becomes easier to answer a specific question. But I think it actually impoverishes in a certain sense, the complexity of the body of ideas generally.
I'm afraid that the Brahma Sutra is the wrong place to look for robust discussions of ethical thought, dharma. Much better places are epics and Puranas and things like that. And one thing that's always struck me about those conversations in the epics and Puranas is a kind of tension between these two senses. You can say kind of the ethical sense of dharma and the sense of that's the nature of the thing to do that. So for instance, what does it mean to be an ethical asura, an ethical demon, a dharmic demon? Is the dharma of the demon to do demonic, horrible things? That's its nature. But yet we find stories of Prahlada as the most famous one, right? Of this demon who seems to go against his dharma as a demon. And he's rewarded and lauded for acting precisely against his nature and adopting a kind of ethics that we human beings who worship gods and participate in Vedic sacrifices. So there is this tension within the tradition itself, I think, over these two senses of dharma, a more ethical one and a more, it is the nature of entity X to do Y one. And I'm afraid this isn't well resolved, and the place to look for it is in this kind of very robust narrative literature like in the Mahabharata. I mean, Wendy Danagar wrote a lot about this a long time ago in the origin of evil in Hindu mythology. I wish there was more on that. That's one of my new directions. I am starting to look more at sort of these, itihasa, as it's called in Sanskrit, these kind of epics and other sorts of texts as a source and foundation of ethical thought, but in a narrative context rather than this kind of systematic, philosophical, theological context. So that tension is there. It's a real tension. It exists, and it's not really well developed in the Brahma Sutras.
The Prahlada example is very good. Because the Prahlada example shows that, he goes against dharma in the first sense.
Yes.
To practice dharma in the second
Exactly.
sense.
Yes. So that brings out very clearly these two opposed, sometimes opposed senses of Dharma.
Should we have one more question, David? Let me give it to let's have two questions.
I'm just wondering about this Shankara, just going to Shankara
Yes.
and the two levels of truth that you spoke about. And then trying to connect that to Shelley's point about the role of kings and temples in about the 10th century.
Okay.
What is you could say, the politics of having two levels of truth? That is there, or the status of karma at the ultimate level of truth?
Yes.
We have Shankaracharyas in India today, Puri and so on, who are political activists. How do they make sense of it? Is really the ultimate level of truth only for people who are very special and enlightened, and the rest of us live in the level of Vyavahara, and we have to just, then that's when ethics comes in,
Yes.
or power comes in, and all of those things that are political.
This is a great question, and I've written I'll plug another one of my articles. I wrote about this in the context of Vivekananda, because he is someone who is both an Advaita Vedantin and a progressive social activist. How do you reconcile this? And there are some German Indologists who just said, he's a fool, he doesn't know anything about Vedanta. He should be off trying to attain moksha if he's a true Advaita Vedantin. But we have these robust traditions of, for instance, Advaita Bhakti in the early modern period. We have, and for the Vivekananda example, his teacher Ramakrishna, who taught what I call the kind of world-affirming Advaita Vedanta, which seems like an oxymoron. But Vivekananda was very consciously in opposition to Shankara. He calls Shankara a Brahmin bigot and says he doesn't know what he's talking about, and the true implications of non-dualism are not shying away from embracing a Chandala, from trying to, work for the betterment of the lives of all beings. And this is a very different understanding of what you can say the ethical implications of Advaita are, and one that, to my mind, Shankara clearly had no knowledge of or interest in, but is a very robust tradition, again, in these kind of narrative literatures and texts like the Adhyatma Ramayana, for instance, that Vivekananda drew so much from. We do get this new, call it world-affirming Vedanta or a Vedantic ethics. So if you're interested in my thoughts on that, there's an article I wrote called Vivekananda's Non-Dual Vedantic Ethics or something like that. I forgot the title, but you can find it online. And it talks a lot about, are there ethical demands that understanding all as one puts on us? And I think there's a strong argument to be made that there are in fact such ethical demands, even though that's not how Shankara understood it at all. And he's attacked by modern Vedantins for precisely that reason.
Yes, last question.
Sorry, I haven't spoken in 3 weeks, so my voice is a bit feeble. Forgive me. Mr. Nicholson.
Yes.
I came across this event Friday. I looked into your work. I like how you think, very incisive. In fact, I'm enjoying this experience. You and this brother right here, it was like mental gymnastics, you two dialogue. To contextualize what I'm about to say, I'm an autodidact. The closest parallel in Raghunathan, a mathematician in the village. I'm from the ghetto. My mother had me at 14. 13, samadhi came upon me all of a sudden. I don't know where it comes from. So some of these questions this question is a bit unorthodox. Preface.
Okay.
If you don't mind, let me play the part of a Negro Socrates. That's a joke, guys. Yes?
Okay.
Socrates' great dictum. The beginning of wisdom is a definition of terms, right? We know that's the logocentric view, right? That's how the logos was pulled from MESAAS, right? And so as a consequence, we have this mathematical framework. So it was this guy, G.E. Moore, his catchphrase. What exactly do you mean? Right? That was G.E. Moore's catchphrase, am I right? What exactly do you mean? So the key terms that we have here, and I've taken a few notes. Law of karma, God, does not create from nothing. The whole ex nihilo thing. So we know ex nihilo, Christianity, that's its basis. And even in Taoism, it says the Tao forms the world from the void, like clay, right? So we see this recurring theme. So, as a consequence, this is my, I'm getting to my questions right here. What Plato realized, and Plato, he extrapolated from Pythagoras and all of these pre-Socratics. Pythagoras underscored the need for a mathematical theology. You understand what I'm saying? In the sense that mathematics will provide the framework, however, in terms of the framework for the metaphysic, but the philosopher's job would have to be to clarify what mathematics meant. So as a consequence, we see the scientific revolution, right? How the revolution starts on the grounds of Galileo and all these guys. They recognize, okay, religion and all the dogma, it's been bullying us for eons. However, if we align ourselves with mathematics, right, we observe the patterns in nature, but if we translate that to a mathematical model, not even a priest in the church can argue that. You see what I'm saying? So this all goes back to Spinoza, his attempts at the axiomatic system, and all these types of things. So, and I'm getting to my question right here. So, when you say, does God exist? That's a bit of a tautology, if you know what I mean. In the sense that if you hold mathematics as the basis, right? This is the language in which the universe is written, right? Well, if you notice in mathematics, the number 1 and the number 0, both of which are neither prime nor composite. Think of that for a second. The number 1 and the number 0 are neither prime nor composite. Now, the Upanishad says Brahman is 1. We know the monotheistic religions, they all have that baby. We know Deuteronomy, the Lord is 1. You notice that thing is 1. And 0. The void. You see the parallels I'm making here? Attempting to use the purest of mathematics is the natural numbers, right? This is philosophy of mathematics. So 1 signifies God in virtually all religions. 0, the void, both of which are neither prime nor composite. So my question for you, good sir, is what exactly do you mean by God?
There's the last question.
Let me qualify it. It was Schopenhauer's birthday a few days ago. He said, the bad thing about religions is that they're all allegorical in nature. So if we interpreted them literally, right? If I say my friend's as big as a house, you wouldn't expect them to be 20 feet, right? That's hyperbole.
So you put a lot on the table there. I certainly can't do justice.
The main question is, what exactly do you mean by God?
By God? God is my inadequate translation of the word Ishvara. Ishvara can mean a worldly king, a lord, someone who has dominion over a place. Very often, just as in Western tradition, when they talk about God, they often think about it in terms of kingship, and so we have to look at sort of kingship and the governance of the king as a social construct. So that seems to be the metaphor that you're absolutely right. They use to describe this thing which, from Shankara's perspective, and of course, Schopenhauer was a big fan of Advaita Vedanta philosophy and the Upanishads, as you probably know.
Yes.
So these are metaphors that we use to describe that which is ultimately indescribable without name or form. This is this idea of the absolute versus conventional level. So you're absolutely right that my translations here, this is always a danger when you put the Sanskrit underneath the English translations, people are going to nitpick. And even if you come up with the best possible translation for a word like Ishvara or like Dharma, as we've seen, it always is either too broad or too narrow, or usually both, frankly. One other thing I'll throw out there just to see, for your interest, a great scholar of Hinduism named Madeleine Biardot said that geometry is to Greek philosophy as linguistics is to Indian philosophy. the basis and paradigm of all of these conversations we're having about karma is based on language, and specifically the language of the Vedic ritual. So Shankara is drawing from Mimamsa, this earlier tradition, deeply concerned with the Sanskrit language, which I believe was the highest eternal language, and analyzing that language, and on that basis, understanding the entire structure of the world. So just like Pythagoras and later Greek philosophers thought that we could understand the world on the basis of mathematics and specifically geometry, many, perhaps most Indian philosophers thought it was linguistics that was the source that would allow us to understand the structure of the world. And I'll point you to one great philosopher, Bhartrhari, who wrote a text called the Vakyapadiya, which means on sentences and words. And it talks about the relationship of part and whole in language. And this as a model for the entire structure of the universe. So definitely, I think you'll enjoy that. Check out this Bhartrhari on sentences and words.
Good.
So,
Let's leave it at that. Thank you very much. Let's carry on. We can carry on.